In 500 years, we've learned more about the language. We've learned better interpretation. We have better manuscripts. And I like it when you have the humility to when someone says, actually, I don't think you got it right. And later on the translator go, you're right. Let's update that translation there. Welcome back to Jesus versus America. Jesus told us that we couldn't serve two masters, and so many of us are trying to serve Jesus and also to try to follow the American culture. I'm John, and I'm joined by my good friends Monique and Wisdom. Together, we represent three generations that are faithfully trying to follow Jesus in this culture, and to peel them apart at times and to ask questions about our faith and how it's influenced by the American culture. Today, we're responding to a question that you provided, and we're very grateful whenever anybody asks us a question in the comments that we could address. The question was regarding a recent episode where we were saying that one of the challenges in 1 Corinthians 6 is to try to understand the exact meaning of a certain word. Now, if you've ever studied a commentary or ever looked at any of the work of translation, there are words that are hard to translate. Yeah. The question that was asked, or even to understand what's the best translation, the question is, would God, no matter the translation, allow his word to be wrong or mistranslated in any way? Would he not want his word to be perfect? And if every translation is saying the same thing and other connections of the Bible also address the issue, would that not be correct? I'll address the last part first because I think that is the way we sometimes need to confirm our translations as we look at how the word's used elsewhere throughout the Bible, how it's used even sometimes outside the Bible to try to understand have we translated correctly. And if we have confidence in this context, for example, or others to support it, then that is a good sign and that other translators have come to the same conclusion. But it is still a translation. Mm-hmm. So the first part of the question, would God, no matter the translation, allow his word to be wrong or mistranslated in any way? I don't know about wrong, but I do know that there are probably plenty of translations that are not as good as other translations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is a good answer to give, which is that to the degree we think that we have all of what the Bible represents in Greek and in Hebrew and in parts in Aramaic, there is still the task for us to translate it properly. Mm-hmm. And that is really the response. The question is that the people will have to make decisions about translation, and there are better translations and worse translations. And by the way, there are some that get this verse better than others and this verse better than others. And that's why it's good to consult a number of translations. And people who go to seminary go back and study the original languages because we're still translating into a foreign language of the Bible, right?
Is this a question of inerrant or infallible for those listening, or is that parallel?
And define that for some.
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate about whether the Bible contains any errors at all. Like some people believe there's no errors. That's an inerrant position. It's also somewhat synonymous with the word infallible, that it's perfect in everything that it teaches. It'll conveniently, that is not what this issue is about, right? And the reason it's not about that, and we can talk about that on a different episode about how people view, but the actual, if you take the most conservative view of inerrancy, it was probably a statement that was done in the 1970s. It's the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. So this is the statement that a bunch of people came together to affirm the inerrancy of the Bible. And of course, there's
being
people
it without error.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are people who don't believe this and critique this view, but let's take the most conservative view. The Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy in Article 10 says, we affirm that inspiration, strictly speaking, applies only to the autographic text of Scripture. What does that mean in plain English? They're saying that inerrancy only applies to the originals that were written in either Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic by the biblical authors. And so there's two kind of competing concepts that come in. One is called transmission, and the other one's called translation. So I think we all know what translation is. We have to translate those words into our language or into other languages, right? Transmission is, how do we know that we have the original autographs? Because they don't exist anymore.
Right.
So what biblical scholarship does in transmission is it finds all of these ancient copies And let's say you might have 3,000 or 4,000 copies of a fragment of the book of John, for example.
Yeah.
And they compare them and they know, like, this is dated later, this is dated earlier, this is dated pretty close to the time it was written, although pretty close might be a century or two away.
Yeah.
This is a much later one in the Middle Ages. And they'll put them all together and they'll say, look, in the transmission and people copying it over and over and over, you might hear the popular notion that it's like a game of telephone. Things get changed. But the scientific evidence, and actually from people who don't even believe in what the scriptures teach, is that this is the most carefully transmitted book and series of books. The Bible's not one book. There's like 66 books, right? And so we find different manuscripts along the way. And when you lay them down, you think, okay, there might be like a grammatical change, right? Some of these were written where there weren't vowels in the language, right? So
commas where there weren't commas.
There might be something here that helps us. But when you put together several hundred or several thousand, you think it's remarkable that over hundreds of years there was
it's like unified in what it affirms.
And every once in a while we find an older manuscript and everybody gets excited, like, oh, this one dates even earlier. And the first thing they do is they pull it out and it might again be just a fragment.
Yeah.
And they go, well, let's compare that. Like, was there any change during that period? Like, even if we only have like a few verses or a chapter or two or part of a letter, we can go back and compare it and go, look, they really, really took this seriously and they transmitted this very carefully. So that's transmission. But even then, you have to translate. And so, for example, one of the big debates in the church is over, is the King James Bible the only authorized translation? We won't get into that. It's a whole thing by itself. But
she's rolling up her sleeves.
First of all, the King James wasn't a translation. They were actually editing an earlier version, right? The Bishop's Bible. And that's actually written in the King James Bible. It says, like, we're not making a new translation.
Tell them.
But at that time, they had certain manuscripts that they were going back to check. And in 500 years, we've discovered so many more and can kind of go back. So that's one thing. But every version of the Bible, no matter what translation you pick up, there was a committee of people that had to read in Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic and make decisions about what word is the closest in English. Right. And someone will pick this word and someone will pick that word. And by the way, this is true even of like non-controversial places. So let's take John 3:16. If you read it in Greek, which I don't, but I mean, I could look at a literal Greek Bible and see it transliterated for me. It basically says, for God so loved the cosmos. It doesn't say world, although world is our word that we've used, right? It actually is a Greek word. And that word could be translated as the people of the world, the whole world, the entire universe, right?
Yeah.
We made a decision to say world fits best because if you go on in the verse, it says whoever believes in him. So it's probably talking about people. So, like it could have said for God so loved people, right? Or for God so loved all people.
Humanity.
But, right. He could have, that could have been the translation. And there might be a version right now in English that uses that because, or somebody might say, no, I want to use the word cosmos because I want to remind people, like it does in Colossians 1, that God loves the entire cosmos. He holds it all together. Sin infected everything, not just this little area of people's souls. As far as the curse is found, we saying, like it just is. That is what Jesus will heal sometime and renew. So it's a decision you have to make, right? But does that mean that there's terrible translations? Sure.
Yeah.
And you have to do the work. And so would God allow that? I mean, apparently he has, because you can go on Amazon and find terrible translations or ones that get it wrong or ones that use outdated manuscripts or methods. I think there's something like 450 translations in English alone.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So I think that probably says, yes, it could happen. That's why when we were on the show, we were trying to ask, what does this word mean? And this isn't our view. This is the view of some scholars saying he thinks it's disputed. I don't know that it's as disputed as he does, but that's the argument.
So if someone's Bible shopping, how should they go about finding a translation? And then secondary, if someone has a long-standing Bible, but a new version of it has come out, do they toss that Bible and then get a new one? What would you advise for Bible shoppers?
I mean, I'm a fan of having multiple translations, but of course the thing today is you can do that online, right?
Yeah.
Everyone, everyone online I know could go to Bible Gateway, right? And they have like 50 translations. You just drop the menu and change the translation. So when I'm studying, and that's probably not the most mature way to study, there's software out there that you can do all sorts of things with if you're a serious Bible scholar. But if you're just reading a translation, you think, I wonder what other translations say. You
Yeah.
can go find out without buying a single book.
Yeah.
You can just go online,
click and switch.
look and say, I want to see. Now, there are different methods of translation. Like some people say, I want literal, even though it's almost impossible to do, right? Everybody says, well, we want to recover the true meaning. But meaning in language is all about interpreting like what word comes closer,
Yeah.
as opposed to the actual literal word
Right.
might not mean the same thing to us, or we might not understand
Well, just
it.
think about language today, even slang words that are
Right.
like gibberish that
Right.
people are, and someone 200 years from now is going to find a piece of paper that says skibbity or so, whatever. You know what
Or
I'm
they're
saying?
going to think a butt dial and a booty call are
And
the
they're
same
like,
thing.
what is that?
Yeah.
Like things carry cultural meaning, and that gets lost sometimes over the years. It's hard to know.
Language changes, right?
Language is
Right.
constantly
Totally.
changing, and anyone that knows more than one language even now, you know that there's certain words in one of the languages that you know that you can't fully explain. Like, because I speak Spanish and English, and there are times where, I mean, I can't give an example right now off of the top of my head, but someone will be like, what does this mean? And I'm holding the word and I'm like, it's kind of this, but it's also this. And it's so hard, like even now, to pick one like word
Yeah.
for word. You can't always translate word for word.
It's hard. And English especially, by the way, we have so many synonyms in
Yes.
English. English is a very, in some ways, a very precise language because
Yeah.
we have so many words that mean just
Right.
a hair different. And we're always looking for just the right one, even in our own communications with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? But we struggle with this, like the Greek word pistis, which a lot of people could translate as belief or faith. Other people are saying it's closer to allegiance. It's closer to trust. It's like, well, we have all of those words. Which one are we
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
pick?
yeah, yeah,
you know? And
You're
some people
looking
say
for that perfect.
yeah, some
Yeah.
people say like even if you say for whoever believes in him, that has caused a lot of damage because we think it's up here in the American mind. Belief is an intellectual thing,
right.
as opposed to in a Near Eastern mind, it literally means put your life's weight on it potentially,
it's
right?
so different.
Different, right?
Yeah.
The word could be so somebody could say, well, actually the closest literal word
Yeah.
might be belief. But if I'm going to communicate the true meaning,
Right.
maybe I need something else like allegiance or trust or
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah.
And so an amplified Bible
Like
will come in
literally
and
the
add a
na-
bunch of words,
It's
you know?
literally the nature of language.
Yeah.
So then
Yeah.
what do you suggest then? For someone that's just, it's like, because I've had this question, like, which one do I get? And
Yeah.
where do I start?
Look, I'm going to recommend a couple that probably are good translations. So one of them that's common is the NIV, New
Yeah.
International Version. That I think is fairly common and it is in many, many hands already. So
Yeah.
there's a good chance
I
if
like
you're
that
studying
one.
with somebody.
A lot of good footnotes
right,
too.
Right. And there's and then there's others ones that like the ESV, right? The English Standard Version is a good translation. But again, when people come to it, they're making decisions in the translation. So people who study the ESV tend to be more conservative and they like the conservative nature. And there's times when like a word could be translated as men or women. And they're like, no, it's translated as men. Like it could be both, but the decision is made. And by the way, there are other versions like the RSV and the NRSV that'll do the opposite. They'll translate it in a little different tilt because
Yeah.
it's within the range of meaning. So let's go with this one. And that's why I'd say, I don't know, there's like those are kind of the ones that I would live around somewhere. It's probably the NIV, maybe the ESV. But I'm always looking at other translations. And the beautiful
Yeah.
thing is when I'm reading a commentary, which is something that you should do if you're teaching, they'll actually say like, the NIV doesn't quite get this word right.
Yeah.
And I remember I would read that a lot of times and I'd look and I go, hey, mine got it right. What happened? And that's because they updated it.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
the older NIV, I look at the commentary, it was like done in the 90s.
It's like a new iPhone. It's like you got to upgrade your
They actually listened and thought, yeah, that's right. Somebody
Yeah.
critiqued it.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things that I think
Right.
I'm troubled by about the King James only concern. It's like there is no critique you can give. It is literally, they think of it as inspired by God, dropped into everybody's lap. So that's strange because in 500 years, we've learned more about the language. We've learned better interpretation. We have better manuscripts. And I like it when you have the humility to when someone says, actually, I don't think you got it right. And later on the translator go, you're right. Let's update that translation
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
make a better version of it.
It's an ongoing thing, just like science. Like it's an academic practice.
It is. And I think what most people don't know about Bible transmission and even translation is there are many people that are involved in studying this that are not necessarily believers who will
No.
affirm that this
Yeah.
is transmitted incredibly accurate and we have to
Yeah.
translate it. I might doubt what it says, right? But I'm
or
not
you might
doubting.
not agree with it or want to follow the faith, but you can
Yeah.
from the outside looking in as an historian
Yeah, and that's a common misperception. Like I have
Yeah.
a neighbor that came over recently because his son has kind of come to faith and he's not a believer. And he said to me, he's like, I'm talking to my son about this, and I'm telling him it changed so many times, son. You don't even know what it says because they keep changing it. And he looks at me and goes, right? And I was like,
Tell him, John, right?
Actually, no, that's not my belief at all. But it's such a common thing to think that like
changing
everybody
it?
knows that
No,
it's been
but-
changed a million times. Actually, like scholarship, if
Right.
you look into it, not just Christian scholarship, will tell you, no, actually, this is probably the most carefully preserved and transmitted series of writings ever. So we can do that. I want to give credit to Katie Orr, who wrote a blog post about translation, and she made a couple points that I think would be helpful when you're asking what translation should we get. Her comment was, the fact that we have any translations of the Bible in our language is a gift.
Yeah.
There are people groups in the world who still don't have a single translation in their language. So the fact that we have 450 just reminds us of how privileged we are as North American Christians, as American Christians, English-speaking Christians.
Like,
There's
not only
so
is it in
many.
your language, but we have like 50.
And there's arguments going
Yeah.
online. This is better. Mine's better. You got it wrong.
Yeah.
You're a heretic. The fact that we have any is a gift, right?
Yeah.
And the second thing she said is the fact that we have so many points to our privilege as well. And then we have the ability, especially now we don't even have to buy them. In the old days, you had to buy like those ones that had like 4 translations right next to each other, or you'd have to buy like 5 or 6 different Bibles and go through them, which is still a good practice to have physical Bibles and to read them. But now we can actually put them, compare them on a screen, drop down. You can look at what the literal word means in Greek and see all the different meanings, and then go see how different translators made the decision. And I would say for the most part, many of them, they're important. There are a few verses where it matters, the translation. Maybe the theology changes, maybe the meaning changes, but for the most part, most of these things are really good to get accurate.
Yeah.
But we're really still got a lot of work to do in interpreting and understanding what it means, and then to apply it, even if we get it perfectly right, which we won't. We still have a lot of work to do. But we love the question. Thank God, and I mean thank God, that we live in a place that has translations in our language.
Yeah.
So many of them that we can do this. But yes, it is true that we have the responsibility to look for good translations, to consult several of them, and to remember that we're always reading it in a foreign language. This wasn't written in English. And for those of us who always say, well, it's plain as day, it's right there, we're already reading something that has been translated and interpreted in the translation to get to us.
Right.
So we should have a little bit of humility as
And
we
nuance
study.
and understanding.
Make room.
You make room.
Hold
It's
things with an
great.
open hand. Let the Holy Spirit illuminate your reading more than us deciding what it says to support whatever we came to it with. So that's the answer to the question. We love the questions. Send us more questions so that we can address them in future episodes. This is Jesus versus America.
Follow us on all social media platforms at Jesus versus America, and find more resources on our official website, jesusversusamerica.com.